Thank you, Marina. I have a lot of thank yous, but I don't have time to give them, so maybe I'll do it at the end of the talk or during the discussion. And I only have 20 minutes to take on the task that was given to me, is to give a broad perspective of urban ecosystem services. So what I'm going to do is jump right into my take-home messages. And what do? This isn't working. Oh, there we go. First take-home message. It ain't easy being green. And as Kermit the Frog here is saying to Mayor Bloomberg of the great city of New York, and I think all of us in this room, there's some very obvious reasons why that might be. We think of urban habitats as artificial environments, very harsh environments. We have built structures, there's pollution and things like that. However, there's some really important ecological reasons this might be true. And from the perspective of evolutionary time frame, we're dealing with habitats that are relatively novel. Cities have only been around about 5,000 years. That's not a long time from an evolutionary perspective. And also, humans have brought together intentionally and unintentionally assemblages of species that are novel. They're unique, never been seen before in the face of the planet. So there's a sorting out that's going on within this system. And this is going to drive me a little crazy. Oh, here? I guess you're right. So I got to go over my shoulder? Okay. So basically, what we're dealing with when we introduce plants into these habitats, we're introducing them off-site. So we have to take care of them. And then when we introduce domesticated pets, for example, this is my cat Vinny, into these landscapes, they can have really huge harm to local bird populations because they haven't sorted out yet. They're still getting used to being with each other. And if anybody notices the resemblance between Vinny and myself, you get a prize. But despite these limitations, and I should probably say, in spite of these limitations, as urban ecosystem ecologists, we've been finding very high levels of biological activity in urban landscapes. We're finding high flux rates. We're finding relatively large sinks for things like carbon and nitrogen. There's resources available, lots of resources available. Global climate change has already occurred in our cities. We have elevated carbon dioxide levels, which plants generally like. We have lots of nitrogen, we have lots of phosphorus, lots of calcium. I can go on and on. These are high resource availability in urban landscapes in general. And of course, because of human desires, we'll also supplement things that we want to see in the landscape. And that's not even working. Okay. There's a third take-home message, and that we're dealing with, as ecologists, what I call a new heterogeneity. We haven't been studying urban landscapes for very long. We've spent the better part of the last 100 years trying to quantify and describe natural systems and their heterogeneity. And it's only been in the relatively recently been looking at urban landscapes. And I say new heterogeneity because actually, which is interesting, is that it's not necessarily more complex. We actually homogenize landscapes through our development processes and through our management practices. And so it depends on the scale of observation. Some landscapes might be actually more complex, some will actually be less complex. And we need to think about this not only in 2 dimensions, but we need to think about it in 3 dimensions. So we need to think about soil column and the air atmospheric column. Tom Whitlow will talk a little bit more about that. And then we also have to include the 4th dimension of time, because these are very dynamic systems for the most part. There are other processes that actually occur more slowly, like succession. So this new heterogeneity, this is really going to, oh, there we go. But perhaps our biggest challenge with dealing with this new heterogeneity is the human behavior and decision-making that takes place out in that landscape. And for ecologists, that's the biggest fear that we have, because we're not used to dealing with people. So we know, anybody here that's raised a teenager knows that humans have the capacity to make irrational decisions. We already saw from Ann Bartuska that culture and value systems vary spatially and temporally in these landscapes. And of course, it's very difficult from an ecosystem service perspective to quantify intrinsic and also monetary values. Maybe the battery needs to be replaced. The fourth take-home message, and this is an important one, is that all life on Earth is limited by energy, which suggests that if an organism puts energy into one function, it's going to be having to take away energy from another function. And this is one of the hardest things I learned growing up, that I couldn't do it all the time. And that's the same is true with organisms. That's why we don't have superorganism that dominates all habitats on the Earth, because of these trade-offs. And the same is very much true with ecosystem services. And one of my favorite examples, and Diane Pataki might talk about this a little bit in her work, is water use efficiency with trees. I don't have time to talk about that, though. I'll talk more about it later. The fifth take-home message is that we are on a steep learning curve. Ecology is relatively young science relative to the other sciences. The ESA, Ecological Society of America, is going to have their 100th anniversary in a couple years. And the discipline of urban ecology is younger still. We've only been really intensively studying these systems for the last 20 years in North America. That's not to say that good ecological work was happening before that. It's just that the intensity has greatly increased. But we are in a steep learning curve. We don't have the data, and we still have a long way to go with the understanding. And I'll talk more about that later. So getting to Marina's idea of what is the definition for urban, this is going to be mine for the rest of the talk. And basically, it's a threat for me. We need to develop an ecological definition of urban. We've got lots of other definitions, but let's this one I propose as an ecological definition is that there's some threshold in the landscape that once people get to that density, that you have to start bringing in resources from somewhere else. So you can think of subsistence agriculture. You can think about water resources and so on. So once this happens, you have to start importing resources to sustain that population. And that then causes a disservice somewhere, sometimes at great distances. We don't use these resources 100% efficiently, so we have a waste stream. So that also can impact ecosystems sometimes at great distances. And so people have, a lot of research has been done on this, and they talk about ecological footprint of cities, and some going as far as calling them parasites on the landscape, surrounding landscape. So if you read this literature, you'd think cities are really bad. Well, I propose no, cities are part of the solution. And especially if you look at it from a per capita basis. This is my mom. She grew up in New York City, Sicilian family. Nobody in their family, 5 sisters, grandparents, never learned how to drive to the day they died. They didn't have to. They had mass transit. They can walk and get what they needed. And so on a per capita basis, in comparison to people living in suburbia where you might have to drive 5 miles to get a quart of milk, the footprint is actually less. And so there's data to support this. As population densities increase, now it works. As population densities increase, we get a smaller carbon footprint. So, of course, and this is the social scientists can talk about this, but cities are also centers of finance, technology, and innovation. So, but there's a trade-off. I talked about the trade-offs that might occur at distances, the footprint from cities. There's also a trade-off, obviously, in the locality. As you start putting people on top of living on top of each other, we're going to start diminishing resources and services locally. And so to get around this historically, humans have developed the concept and have developed great infrastructure. So a whole field of civil engineering has developed. And two of my favorite cities on the planet, Rome and New York City, are great examples. And so we can, here in Rome, over 2,000 years ago, we had engineers developing great infrastructure to deal with stormwater and sanitary effluent, and also to bring in potable water into the city. And then later in the Industrial Revolution, when disease outbreaks in cities and things like that, civil engineers came to the fore, and they developed similar kinds of systems, much more complicated systems, and with wild success. It's been a huge success. However, and this suggests also that engineers are way ahead of the ecological sciences. And so there's a downside to gray infrastructure, though, and that is that they have side effects. Gray infrastructure interrupts natural flow paths. And so a great example of this is a hydrograph of an urban watershed compared to a forested watershed. Engineers to design the system so that they get the water off the site as quickly as possible, so you get this peak, high energy flow, lots more water going through because there's no storage or very limited storage versus the forested landscape. We all kind of familiar with that. But what does that do? You take care of the problem locally, but you pass it downstream. The other problem in gray infrastructure is that it's imperfect and degrades with time. And a very good paper by Kushel and Belt recently came out in Urban Ecosystems, 2012, where they talk much more about this. But essentially, those sanitary cities that were being developed in the turn of the century are starting to crumble. The infrastructure is starting to crumble, it's leaking, and it causes all kinds of problems. And there we go. And so in some of the watersheds that we've been monitoring in the Baltimore ecosystem study, the highly urbanized ones, we actually get base flow in the pipes. And so where's that base flow coming from? Probably leaky sanitary sewers or potable water pipes. And actually, in some cases, the total load of phosphorus and nitrogen coming out of that watershed is much higher from the base flow in some years than actual storm flows. This is a huge finding that has a lot of implications. There's a plus side to all this, though, in that anybody that sees really big street trees growing in a street with concrete all around it, they're probably getting their nitrogen and water through these leaky systems. And we have data to support that from the Baltimore ecosystem study. We're still working on that. It's not as all bad. Okay, so what's the net effect then of all these changes on the landscape to ecosystem services? Now, this has been looked at quite extensively in agricultural conversions. And so a wonderful paper by Foley et al., 2005, talk about this. They use these rose diagrams to indicate, the ecosystem services that are being provided. So a natural system gives you multiple ecosystem services. You convert that to a high-grade cropland system, and you lose those services, although you gain the crop production. And crop production, of course, is very important. But the idea then is to try to get all of them in and get this multiple functioning landscape. Now, what's interesting about this is that to get that one service, it's a relatively simple process. Not necessarily easy, but it's simple. Any wildlife biologist, if you go to them and say, I want more rabbits, they can give you more rabbits. They can manage for more rabbits. Want more deer? I can manage for more deer. When you want more species richness and ecosystem function in an area, that's a much more complicated problem. So in agricultural ecology, they've been looking at some of the trade-offs from this cropland production, and they've been actually working with different crop systems, and they've been able to show, this is trace gas fluxes here, so the lower the trace gas flux, the better, that they can develop some systems where you can get some of these services back. So the question is, can we do that in urban landscapes? So as an example, this is the Cub Hill Eddy Flux Tower. John Hom from the U.S. Forest Service is the PI in this project. And this is just the first 3 years' data. And so this is a suburban landscape without getting into the specifics. Anything below this line is a negative flux, so that means carbon's being taken up by the vegetation. And then during the summer months, we get this really big sink in this suburban landscape. We got very excited about that, actually. But when we factored in the sources, there was still the sink was swamped by those sources. And there's a good reason for that. One is there's a lot of sources, right, in urban areas. But the other is that there's impervious surfaces out there, so you're not going to be able to get carbon sequestration on an impervious surface. So the question is, can we actually enhance these sinks in these landscapes? Oh, boy. See, that was supposed to happen, that was supposed to happen. Okay, and so we come to this concept of developing hyperfunctional landscapes, and this is an idea by Tom Whitlow, who's going to be a speaker this morning, in which on a per unit area basis, you try to increase the service. And so in this case, you try to get more of a carbon sink. Oh boy. I want more time for my presentation. There we go. Okay. So let's go back to the Rose diagram that Foley et al. Used for agricultural systems. And so, again, you have these natural systems with multifunction. And we can use infrastructure, and that's what we've done in the past to kind of make up for some of those lost functions as we urbanize landscapes. But what we're really after is a multi-hyper-functioning landscape, ultimately. And so this, I thought, was a great multi-function for turfgrass. Just kidding, of course. So what happens when we convert from a natural landscape to an urban landscape? And so it's a two-pronged process, one in which we're pretty familiar with, more direct kinds of effects. There's, as soon as the European settlers came to North America, what did they start to do? Parcelize the landscape. They had a sense of land ownership that the Native Americans did not have. This results in fragmentation. As you increase the population density, fragments get smaller, parcels get smaller. We've changed disturbance regimes, we've introduced new disturbances, and we've actually introduced management. Often neglected in this is the idea that the environment changes as well. And so global environmental change has already occurred in our cities. So you have, this is much more of an indirect effect. You overlay these with the built environment over the native system, and you get what I call the urban mosaic, which to me is one giant natural experiment that we can utilize, if I can advance the slides. And so we can look at this urban mosaic where we have relatively small parcels here with humans making decisions about maintaining their landscape, which is very scary to ecologists, makes it much more complicated. We have vestiges of the native system. We have fallow systems, a surprising amount of fallow systems, corridors, and so on and so forth. And so within that matrix, then, we can identify a continuum of habitat conditions that basically go from, relates to how much human influence there is in the landscape. So you have these highly cultivated systems, which most urban forestry is focused on, but we have also these naturalized systems with remnants, fallow systems, and so on and so forth. And there's a surprising amount of naturalization going on in these landscapes. Dave Nowak recently published a paper where they kept track in iTree of the number of trees that were planted versus naturalized, and many more trees are naturalized than planted, especially in landscapes where trees naturally grow. So this is something we've been observing in Baltimore for a long time. But when we think about ecosystem services, we need to place them now within the context of the new heterogeneity, the urban mosaic, and this continuum that I'm talking about here. And so one way to do this is very similar to what they're doing in agroecological research. I showed that to you before. What are some of the trade-offs that occur as we urbanize landscapes? Here's a very good example. Methane, of course, is a greenhouse gas. Soils, typically, these are negative numbers. Soils are typically sinks for methane, so forest soils in particular. So in this case, we have, we're comparing a rural forest patch with an urban patch, and so this is the environment effect, basically, of urbanization. And that's, we lose roughly half of the sink for methane when that happens. But when we convert to turf grass, we have a really huge trade-off where we don't have any sink at all remaining. So going from a forest to a grassland, to a turf grass system, big trade-off. So we can do that and learn about these trade-offs. So how do we then develop multiple functioning, hyper-functioning landscapes? Well, we have a long way to go, I propose, in developing hyper-functional landscapes. But I like to look at it as integrating green infrastructure, which we all talk about and think about, but there's also brown infrastructure, which is soil, and then the blue infrastructure. And integrating these is a way to get the multiple function. And it's probably better to do it in series rather than parallel. What I mean by series, you can imagine a green roof that drains into a rain garden, which drains into a stormwater retention system. The retention is for the really big events. The green roof and the rain garden can do the smaller events. So that's in series rather than parallel. And so the advantages of blue, brown, and green: avoid side effects, for example, those high peak flows, utilizes biological processes, so they're somewhat self-maintaining, preserves function of the pre-existing ecosystems, and that's for free. That's all free. And if we can get them to work in tandem, I think we can get multi and eventually hyper-functioning landscapes. Lastly, we need to consider trade-offs. And this is my final big point, and if I could get it to work. We have to think about risk when we develop these systems. And risk is really important locationally. Where you plant a tree, for example, is very important. So risk in time and space, unintended effects that occur. We have to think about the performance of these infrastructures, and because of the new heterogeneity, so in space and time, it's not the performance of all these are going to vary in space and time depending on those conditions and that continuum. All right. And we also have to think about the longevity of these systems, and also we also have to think about the distance effects, that some of these trade-offs occur at great distances. If we're mining topsoil in Long Island to plant gardens in New York City, that's not very sustainable. So how does this then relate to decision making? And I would propose that because of these trade-offs, by making a bad decision is worse than making no decision at all. So we really have to be careful with making decisions on the landscape about these services. And finally, we really need to optimize all these multiple factors that we're dealing with. The human brain can't deal with, once you get by 3 axes, I don't know, my brain, I can't do it anymore. So we need to develop, in my view, optimization kinds of models. This has been done in economics for a long time, where a good example is Stu Schwartz, UMBC, where he's looking at nutrient reduction strategies for the Chesapeake Bay, and he developed a strategy for that. And so what he's suggesting is that there's a lot of sources, potential sources, a lot of possible control strategies. And if we think about space and time and that heterogeneity that I was talking about, there's a lot of possibilities out there. And the human brain cannot, by any means, deal with that. And so this complexity then ends up limiting our choices because we don't even want to think about them. But we can do it mathematically with these optimization models. And because we can then consider all the feasible alternatives. So where do we go from here? And I'll finish off. So first of all, we got to continue, in my view, increasing our understanding of urban ecosystems. Remember, we're on a steep learning curve. And this is frustrating. And I think I propose that we could utilize the urban mosaic as suite of natural experiments that we can utilize. I think we need to do more cross-system comparisons. We need to look at the generality of these results, regional and global scales. We have to develop truly integrated models, really have built-in human decision-making in our models because that's a really important potential feedback. We need to expand our urban observations. We need to, choose cities that vary in their development patterns, socioeconomic factors, biome, and regions. And obviously continue to have more site-intensive kinds of studies like the LTER and ULTRAs. But I propose that we need to build in a network function on these intensive sites where all the sites are addressing 1 or 2 questions that are the same, and are also making the same measurements. It makes it much more of a network. We also, I think, that's sort of a top-down approach, big money, LTERs. There's also the bottom-up approach where there are various networks that are out there that we can hook into. A good example is the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. The program measures wet deposition, 300 different places across the continent. And they've always avoided urban areas for various reasons. Now we're trying to move them into urban areas, and we can do this with other networks as well. And last slide, come on. I think we need a new battery. And I think we need to develop decision tools that are capable of optimizing multiple factors. And it was, as we've seen in the agricultural example, there's lots of different ways you can go. There's lots of different ecosystem services that we need to try to build into these multi-functioning landscapes. And it needs to build in uncertainty and risk. And so what we want to do basically is give managers and planners a decision space so that they can make these decisions and that they include all of the possibilities. And finally, I think, and this is already happening to a certain degree, we might actually need a new field of ecological engineering to start developing and designing these multi-functioning or hyper-functioning infrastructures. And of course, that's going to need an integration of urban design, engineering, and ecology. And only until that happens will Kermit be happy. Thank you. Sorry about the